It happened in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least knows of them. Jennings County, Indiana isn't a bustling city. It's quiet mostly. People live their lives, raise their families. And then something happens that shatters all of that. Something so awful it makes you question everything you thought you knew about your neighbors, about human nature itself. This is a story about that kind of something. Rebekah and her daughter Morgan. Their names deserve to be said first. Rebekah Ludwick, 34 years old, and Morgan, her little girl, just 12. They were mother and daughter. They lived a life like many others. Rebekah worked. After Morgan went to school, they had routines, dreams, plans for the future, just like anyone. They were real people, not just names in a newspaper or figures in a police report. They had smiles and laughter, bad days and good days. They were a family, just the two of them trying to make their way. But their lives ended in a way no one could ever imagine. They were found tied to a tree. 2 lives, extinguished with such cruelty, in a remote, wooded area. And when something like that happens, everyone asks the same question, over and over, until their voice gets hoarse. Why? Why them? Why like that? Rebekah was a mother trying her best. She had a job, and she cared for Morgan. Morgan was in 6th grade, a preteen, on the cusp of figuring out who she was going to be. She probably had friends, maybe a crush, school projects, the usual stuff that fills a 12-year-old's world. And then one day, it all just stopped. The day they were found was August 17th, 2011. A Wednesday, not a day that stands out on its own, usually. But for Jennings County, it became a day etched in memory. A mushroom hunter was out in the woods, off County Road 300 North, a few miles outside of North Vernon. Imagine what that person saw. Imagine the horror. 2 bodies, tied to a tree. The details were grim. Rebekah and Morgan were bound with rope face down at the base of a tree. They had been shot. It wasn't a quick, clean act. The tying, the positioning, it all spoke to something more than just a simple killing. It spoke to intent, to malice, to a desire to control, to terrorize. And when the news spread, it wasn't just a local story. It was a jolt. How could this happen here? Who could do something like this? It was a crime that didn't just take 2 lives, it took a piece of the community's peace of mind. Parents looked at their children differently. Doors that used to be unlocked stayed locked. A shadow fell over the quiet streets. The police investigation started immediately. This wasn't a typical case. There were no immediate answers. The scene was remote, but the bodies were found. That was the first big piece of information. They had been killed elsewhere, or perhaps at the scene, and then arranged. The tying was a deliberate act. It wasn't just to keep them from getting away because they were already dead. It felt like a statement. Or maybe it was to make it harder to identify them, to slow down the process, to buy the killers more time. Whatever the reason, it was chilling. Investigators began to work backwards. Who last saw Rebekah and Morgan? What was their last known activity? Family and friends were interviewed. The usual questions, did they have enemies? Was anyone threatening them? Was there anything unusual happening in their lives? The initial picture painted was one of 2 normal people, not involved in anything that would warrant such a brutal end. This made the why even more perplexing. The days turned into weeks. The pressure built. A double homicide, especially one involving a child, demands answers. The community was on edge. Some tips came in, some helpful, many not. Police followed every lead, no matter how small. They were looking for anything that could connect Rebekah and Morgan to someone who would want to hurt them. One of the early things that came up was the possibility of drug involvement. It's an ugly truth, but drugs often intertwine with violence. Rebekah, it turned out, had some history with drug use, specifically methamphetamine. This was a difficult detail for her family, but it was a path the investigators had to follow. It provided a potential link, a possible motive, drug debts, deals gone wrong, conflicts within that world. These can all lead to desperate and violent acts. This wasn't a random act of violence by a stranger. This was personal, or at least connected to people Rebekah knew. The manner of death suggested a level of intimacy, however twisted, between the victims and their killers. Someone knew them, someone brought them to that desolate spot, someone tied them, someone shot them. Eventually, names started to surface. Daniel Burton, Curtis Coomer, Dustin Haefner, Darci Burton. These were the people who would later be charged in the murders of Rebekah and Morgan. It wasn't just one person, it was a group. And that made it even more sinister. A group dynamic can escalate things, make individuals do things they might not do alone. And Daniel Burton was Darci's husband. Darci Burton was Rebekah Ludwick's cousin. This was a familial connection even if distant. It wasn't a stranger on the street. It was someone in her extended circle. That kind of betrayal, that kind of evil from within is even harder to stomach. The motive, as it slowly came out through investigations and later court proceedings, was rooted in robbery and drugs. It sounds so simple, so mundane for such an unspeakable act. But often, the worst crimes stem from the most common human failings: greed, desperation, a hunger for money, especially when fueled by addiction. Rebekah, it was believed, had come into some money. She had received an inheritance around $5,000, and this money, small to some, was a significant sum to people struggling with drug habits and financial woes. It put a target on her back. The inheritance, combined with her history of drug use, made her vulnerable. The plan, as it unfolded in court, was to rob Rebekah of this money, but it went horribly wrong, or perhaps it was never meant to be just a robbery. The details from the co-defendants, particularly Dustin Haefner, who later cooperated with the prosecution, painted a grim picture. On August 16th, the night before they were found, Rebekah and Morgan were at Rebekah's home in North Vernon. Daniel Burton, Curtis Coomer, and Dustin Haefner came over. The initial intent might have been to get money from Rebekah, perhaps through threats. But things escalated quickly. The group forced Rebekah and Morgan into Rebekah's car. They drove them to the remote wooded area. Imagine the terror. A mother and her young daughter being driven into the dark, into the woods, by people they likely knew, or at least recognized. What kind of fear must have gripped Morgan, a 12-year-old, understanding the gravity of what was happening but unable to do anything? Once in the woods, the unspeakable happened. They were bound. The act of tying them to the tree was a deliberate, cruel choice. It wasn't just to stop them from running away. They were already outnumbered, outmatched. It was a way to exert control, to humiliate, to prolong their fear, and ultimately to ensure they were utterly helpless before their killers. It was a cold, calculated act designed to dehumanize them, to reduce them to objects. The rope, the tree, it was all part of the premeditation of violence. After they were tied, they were shot. Rebekah was shot first, then Morgan. It was a monstrous act. 2 lives gone for what? For money, for drugs, for a fleeting moment of perceived gain. The bodies were then left there, tied to the tree, as if a dark monument to the evil that had transpired. The killers left, leaving the mother and daughter, to be discovered hours later. Their final moments, a horrific secret carried by the trees and the soil, until a mushroom hunter stumbled upon the truth. The investigation led to the arrests of Daniel Burton, Curtis Coomer, Dustin Haefner, and Darci Burton. Each played a role, though their levels of involvement and culpability varied. Dustin Haefner became a key witness for the prosecution, agreeing to testify in exchange for a lighter sentence. This is often how these complex cases unravel, with one perpetrator turning on the others to save themselves. The trials were harrowing. The community watched, listened, and relived the horror. The details that came out were difficult to hear. The casual way these lives were taken, the callousness of the perpetrators, it was all laid bare. Daniel Burton and Curtis Coomer were ultimately convicted of the murders. Daniel Burton, the orchestrator, received a life sentence without parole. Curtis Coomer was also sentenced to life in prison. Dustin Haefner, for his cooperation, received a lesser sentence, but still faced significant time behind bars. Darci Burton, Daniel's wife, was convicted of lesser charges for her role in helping to cover up the crime. The convictions brought a sense of justice, but nothing to bring Rebekah and Morgan back. The why still lingered, even with the perpetrators behind bars. How could people do this? How could a small amount of money lead to such an extreme act of violence? The story of Rebekah and Morgan Ludwick is a stark reminder of the devastating intersection of drugs, greed, and violence. It's a tragedy that highlights how lives can be devalued, how human empathy can be lost when addiction and desperation take hold. The act of tying them to the tree in particular speaks to a cruelty that transcends simple murder. It was an act of profound disrespect for human life, a desire to exert ultimate power and control in their final moments. For Jennings County, the murders left a scar. The sense of security, of being in a safe, quiet place, was forever changed. It showed that evil can touch any community, even the smallest, most unassuming ones. And it left a permanent ache for a mother and her daughter whose only mistake was being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong people, for the wrong reason. And so, the question why were they tied to a tree isn't just about the physical act. It's about the state of mind of the killers, the complete disregard for their victims' humanity. It was about making a statement, about exerting control, about inflicting maximum terror and suffering. It was a deeply personal, deeply cruel act that left behind not just 2 dead bodies, but a lasting wound in the heart of a community. And even after the convictions, the memory of Rebekah and Morgan tied to that tree remains a haunting image, a symbol of senseless brutality.